What happens when the most powerful nation on Earth enters a war it cannot win? Welcome to History. We uncover one of the defining conflicts of the 20th century. The Vietnam War, a struggle that began as a regional fight for independence, soon became a global Cold War battlefield. It drew in presidents, generals, students, villagers, and millions of soldiers. It unleashed relentless bombing, brutal jungle combat, political chaos, and protests that shook America itself from the collapse of French colonial rule. In 1954, Vietnam was divided into communist North and anti-communist South. The United States stepped in determined to stop the spread of communism under the Domino theory. What began with money, weapons, and military advisors soon escalated into a full-scale war. 1965, American Marines landed at Dien. Hundreds of thousands of troops followed helicopters, thundered over jungles. Search and destroy missions swept through villages and forests. Operation Rolling Thunder rained bombs on the North. Battles like Battle of Ia Drang and the Tet Offensive revealed a terrifying truth: superior firepower did not guarantee victory. Home television brought the war into living rooms. Confidence collapsed. Anti-war protests spread across campuses and city streets. Presidents rose and fell under the weight of Vietnam. Then came withdrawal, Vietnamization, peace talks in Paris, and finally, in 1975, the world watched desperate evacuations from Saigon. As the war ended not in triumph, but in collapse. Tonight, we follow the full story of how America entered Vietnam, how the war consumed two nations, and how it changed global history forever. This is the story of the Vietnam War. In the humid dawn of Southeast Asia, rice fields stretched beneath mist-covered mountains. Villages awakened to the sound of roosters and bicycle wheels. Yet beneath this calm landscape, a storm was forming. Vietnam, a land of ancient culture and deep resilience, was about to become the center of one of the 20th century's most devastating conflicts. It would draw in peasants and presidents, guerrillas and generals, and the most powerful nation on Earth for nearly a century. Vietnam had been ruled by France. Colonial officials controlled the land, the economy, and the lives of millions. But after the chaos of the Second World War, anti-colonial resistance surged. Leading that movement was Ho Chi Minh, a nationalist and communist who believed Vietnam should govern itself. His forces, the Viet Minh, fought a determined war against the French. In 1954, at the remote fortress, a battle of Dien Bien Phu, French power collapsed. The defeat shocked Europe and signaled the end of colonial rule in Indochina. That same year, world powers met at the Geneva Conference. Their solution was meant to be temporary. Vietnam would be divided at the 17th parallel. The communist North would be led by Ho Chi Minh. The anti-communist South would build its own government with national elections expected later, but temporary lines on a map often become permanent scars. Families were separated. Hundreds of thousands fled south fearing communist rule. Others moved north, believing reunification would come soon for the United States. Vietnam was no longer just a distant country. It became a test of the Cold War. Washington feared that if one nation fell to communism, others would follow. This belief became known as the Domino theory. President Dwight Eisenhower and later John F. Kennedy increased aid to South Vietnam. Money, weapons, and military advisors began to flow across the Pacific. American leaders hoped to prevent a communist victory without sending combat troops in. The South power centered around Ngo Dinh, Diem, strongly anti-communist and backed by the United States. Diem promised order and stability, but his government soon became known for corruption, favoritism, and repression. Political opponents were jailed. Rural communities felt ignored. Buddhist protests grew after the regime favored the Catholic minority instead of creating unity. Diem's rule deepened division while politicians spoke in capitals. The real struggle spread through villages and jungles. Communist organizers in the South built networks of support among farmers frustrated by poverty and war. These insurgents became known to Americans as the Viet Cong. They moved silently through forests, struck suddenly, and disappeared into the countryside. Roads were mine officials were assassinated and government control weakened beyond the cities. The war was becoming invisible, fought in shadows rather than open battlefields. By 1963, South Vietnam was in turmoil. Buddhist monks protested in the streets. Images of self-immolation shocked the world. Washington began to doubt whether Diem could survive or whether he should. In November 1963, South Vietnamese generals launched a coup. Diem was captured and killed. Only weeks later, President Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas. Two governments, two nations suddenly leaderless. now faced an escalating crisis. The new American President Lyndon B. Johnson inherited Vietnam at a dangerous moment. In August 1964, reports emerged of attacks on United States naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Though details remain disputed, the political result was a media Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution granting Johnson broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia. Without a formal declaration of war, what began as aid and advice had transformed into commitment and obligation. America had not yet sent its full armies. But the path was set. Vietnam was no longer a regional struggle. It had become America's war in waiting. In March 1965, American warships anchored off the coast of South Vietnam in United States. Marines came ashore at Da Nang. Officially, they were sent to defend air bases. In reality, they marked the beginning of a new phase of the war. What had once been a mission of advisors and limited support was now becoming a full-scale American military intervention. The United States had crossed a threshold from which retreat would be difficult to President Lyndon B. Johnson believed that failure in Vietnam would damage American credibility around the world. To him and many of his advisors, the struggle was not only about one country. It was about proving that communist expansion could be stopped, so troop numbers rose rapidly. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. Young men from farms, factories, and cities were sent into a landscape Moose had never imagined. At the same time, American aircraft began one of the longest bombing campaigns in modern history. Operation Rolling Thunder, day after day. Bombs fell on bridges, roads, supply routes, and industrial targets in North Vietnam. United States planners hoped the bombing would break enemy morale and force Hanoi to negotiate. Instead, North Vietnam endured, adapted, and continued sending men and supplies southward along the vast network of jungle paths, later known collectively as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. For the soldiers on the ground, Vietnam was unlike any war America had fought before. There were no clear front lines, no obvious safe zones, and often no visible enemy. Dense jungle swallowed sound and distance, heat and humidity exhausted troops before battle even began. Patrols moved through tall grass and tangled trees, never knowing what waited. Ahead, a path could hide a tripwire, a quiet village could conceal armed fighters, an empty field could become a killing zone, and commanders relied on helicopters to move troops quickly across difficult terrain. The image of helicopters rising above the jungle became one of the defining symbols of the war. They carried soldiers into battle, evacuated the wounded, delivered supplies, and sometimes returned under fire. Mobility gave the United States tremendous reach, but it did not guarantee control. One of the first major tests came in 1965 at the Battle of Ia Drang. American forces inflicted heavy casualties, but they also learned a hard truth. The enemy was disciplined, determined, and willing to absorb terrible losses. The war would not be short. Across South Vietnam, search and destroy missions became common. American units entered contested areas to locate enemy forces and eliminate them. Success was often measured by body counts, rather than territory held. Yet villages cleared one week could be reoccupied the next. The enemy chose when to fight and when to disappear. This created a frustrating cycle of tactical victories without strategic resolution. The human cost mounted on all sides. Vietnamese civilians were trapped between armies. Bombings forced relocations and suspicion from every direction. Entire communities were uprooted. Forests were scarred, cities filled with refugees. For many ordinary families, survival became the only goal. Back in the United States, the war entered living rooms through television. Nightly broadcasts showed firefights, burning villages, wounded soldiers, and rows of body bags. For the first time, many Americans could watch war almost as it happened. Official optimism from Washington increasingly clashed with what viewers saw on their screens. Then came January 1968 during the Lunar New Year. Ceasefire. Communist forces launched the Tet Offensive, striking cities, towns, and military bases across South Vietnam. Fighting erupted even inside the United States Embassy compound in Saigon. Militarily, the offensive caused communist forces enormous losses. But politically, it was a turning point. If the enemy could launch attacks on such a scale after years of American escalation, then claims of imminent victory rang hollow. Confidence in the war effort began to collapse. Anti-war protests expanded across college campuses and city streets. Veterans questioned the mission. Families mourned sons who would never return. Journalists, lawmakers, and citizens asked whether victory was possible or whether the war itself was built on false Assumptions inside the White House, the pressure became immense. President Johnson, once determined to persevere, now faced a divided nation and a war with no clear end. In March 1968, he stunned the country by announcing he would not seek another term as President. America still possessed unmatched firepower, vast resources, and hundreds of thousands of troops in Vietnam. Yet power alone was proven insufficient. The jungles still hid an undefeated enemy, and the nation that had entered the war with confidence was now losing something harder to replace: belief. By 1969, the United States had reached a painful conclusion. After years of escalation, enormous military spending, and mounting casualties, victory remained undefined and distant. More than 500,000 American troops had served in Vietnam yet. The war still consumed jungles, villages, and cities with no clear end in sight. Into this crisis stepped Richard Nixon, elected on a promise to achieve what he called peace. President Nixon understood that many Americans wanted the war to end, but he also feared that a sudden withdrawal would damage United States' credibility around the world. His administration introduced a new strategy known as Vietnamization. The idea was simple in theory: gradually reduce American troop levels while expanding and strengthening the armed forces of South Vietnam so they could carry the war themselves. American soldiers began coming home in increasing numbers. Yet the conflict did not fade. Instead, it widened, seeking to disrupt communist supply routes and bases. The United States launched secret bombing campaigns and military operations in neighboring Cambodia and Laos. These moves aimed to weaken North Vietnamese logistics, but they also deepened regional instability and intensified criticism at home. In the United States, the war had become more than a foreign conflict. It was now a national wound. Families were divided over duty and protest. University campuses became centers of resistance. Demonstrations filled the streets of Washington and major cities. Many questioned why the war continued after so many years, and so many deaths. Trust in government was also eroding. Official statements often spoke of progress, yet the public had heard such promises before the release of the Pentagon. Papers revealed years of internal doubts and misleading public claims by successive administrations. For many Americans, it confirmed that the gap between private reality and public messaging had been vague. The battlefield, South Vietnamese forces fought increasingly larger roles. Some performed effectively, especially with American air support. But weaknesses remained: political instability, corruption, dependence on United States resources, and uneven morale. North Vietnam, by contrast, continued to absorb losses and prepare for the long war. It believed time would win. In 1972, North Vietnam launched a major conventional assault known as the Easter Offensive. South Vietnam survived the attack with extensive American air power, including renewed bombing of the North. Yet the battle made clear that despite years of training and support, South Vietnam still depended heavily on United States intervention. Behind the scenes, negotiations had continued for years. In Paris, at last, in January 1973, representatives signed the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of United States forces, and the return of prisoners of war. For Washington had offered a path out of a war that had divided the nation and exhausted its patience. American combat troops departed, prisoners came home. Many hoped the war was finally over, but peace on paper did not mean peace on the ground. Fighting soon resumed between North and South Vietnam without large numbers of United States troops, and with American political attention consumed by domestic crises. South Vietnam's position grew weaker. The Watergate scandal shattered Nixon's presidency and further reduced the appetite in Congress for renewed military involvement. Overseas aid to South Vietnam declined. In early 1975, North Vietnam launched its final offensive. This time, resistance in the South collapsed with startling speed. Cities fell one after another. Refugees crowded roads and ports. Units disintegrated. Panic spread faster than orders could restore control. April, communist forces had reached the outskirts of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The world watched as helicopters landed atop rooftops and embassy compounds in scenes that would become among the most famous images of the 20th century. Americans, diplomats, and thousands of desperate Vietnamese civilians scrambled for escape during the final evacuation on April 30th, 1975. Saigon fell. Tanks entered the city. The government of South Vietnam surrendered. The long war that had drawn in empires, superpowers, and millions of ordinary lives had come to its final act. The city was later renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and in 1976, the country was formally reunified under communist rule. Cost of the war was immense. Millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians were dead. More than 5.80 Americans had lost their lives, and many more returned wounded in body. Or mine entire landscapes had been devastated. Generations carried the trauma. Forward for the United States, Vietnam became more than a military defeat or a political controversy. It became a lesson in the limits of power, the dangers of misjudging foreign wars, and the lasting human price of decisions made far from the battlefield. Even decades later, the name Vietnam still echoes not only as a place, but as a warning. The Vietnam War ended more than 50 years ago, but its lessons remain as urgent as ever. It showed that military strength alone cannot guarantee victory. It revealed how politics, public trust, and human resilience can shape the fate of nations just as much as weapons and armies, and it left scars carried by millions across Vietnam, the United States, and beyond, from the divided map of 1954 to the jungle battles of escalation to the helicopters above Saigon. In 1975, this was not just a war. It was a turning point that reshaped the modern world, but history does not end here. If the war had never escalated, could South Vietnam have survived? And how did this conflict influence later wars in Afghanistan and Iraq? Those stories are waiting to be explored. Thank you for watching History Ledger. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more true powerful stories from history, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next journey into the past. Until next time, history remembers.